In this series of short videos, we will be introducing you to the Military Aviation Preservation Society, or MAPS Air Museum, and some of the aircraft and displays that are located at our facility in Greene, Ohio. We hope that these presentations enhance your appreciation of history and those that lived it. Man's fascination with flight and a desire to fly has always been with us. A quote attributed to Leonardo da Vinci gives you only one view of this obsession. It reads, "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will always long to return." At MAPS, the history of aviation is more than just airplanes. It is about those who have dreamed of flying, those who ultimately made those dreams a reality, and those that have experienced the freedom of flight. We hope to share that and more with you in these video presentations. We hope to cover the general background of each type of aircraft, as well as the history of the actual airframe that we have here at the museum. In some cases, we have dedicated specific aircraft to local men and women. If this is the case, we will discuss why we decided to dedicate an aircraft to them. In this video, we will be introducing you to the Douglas A-26 Invader. The Invader was an American twin-engine light bomber and ground attack aircraft built by the Douglas Aircraft Company during World War II. The Invader also saw service during several major Cold War conflicts in the 1950s and 60s, becoming the first American bomber to fly missions in 3 wars. A limited number of highly modified United States Air Force Invaders also served in Southeast Asia until 1969. The A-26 was Douglas Aircraft's successor to the A-20 Havoc, also known as the Douglas Boston, one of the most successful and widely operated types flown by Allied Air Forces in World War II. The design was crafted by Douglas engineers Ed Heineman, Robert Donovan, and Ted R. Smith. The innovative laminar flow airfoil wing of the A-26 was the work of project aerodynamicist A.M.O. Smith. The Douglas XA-26 prototype, Army Air Corps serial number 42-19504, first flew on July 10, 1942 at Mines Field El Segundo. Flight test revealed excellent performance and handling, but engine cooling problems led to cowling changes and elimination of the propeller spinners on production aircraft. Additionally, the first flights also revealed a weakness in the nose landing gear. Repeated collapses during testing led to the reinforcement of the nose gear. A second prototype, designated XA-26A, was developed as a night fighter. It carried an air intercept radar on the nose and armament in a pod under the fuselage. Originally designed as a night fighter, the XA-26A was beaten by the Northrop P-61 Black Widow for the night fighter contract. The XA-26A existed as a single prototype. In June of 1942, the initial Army Air Corps contract was amended to add an additional prototype aircraft. From these specifications for a ground attack aircraft, Douglas developed the XA-26B aircraft at the El Segundo plant in California. The A-26B nose could be equipped with a combination of armament, including 50 caliber machine guns or 20 or 37 mm autocannon. The B-gun nose version housed 6 and later 8 50 caliber machine guns. The Army Air Corps accepted the design on June 30, 1943, and production started at 2 Douglas plants, one in Long Beach, California, and the other in Tulsa, Oklahoma. After about 1,570 A-26B production aircraft were built, 3 guns were installed in each wing, coinciding with the introduction of the 8-gun nose, giving some configurations as many as 14 50 caliber machine guns in fixed forward mounts. The B model was eventually followed by the A-26C. Instead of the gun nose found on the A-26B model, the A-26C featured a glass bombardier nose containing a Norden bomb sight for medium altitude precision bombing. The A-26 nose section included 2 fixed M2 50 caliber machine guns. The nose guns were eliminated after underwing gun packs or internal guns in the wings proved effective during cold weather. The loss of weight realized by removing the A-26B gun nose resulted in an increase in speed from 355 to 370 miles per hour. An A-26C nose could be replaced with an A-26B nose section or vice versa in a few hours, thus physically changing the designation and operational role of the aircraft. One of the unique features of the XA-26 was the single pilot cockpit, not requiring a dedicated co-pilot and keeping the fuselage a slender shape. Alongside the pilot in an A-26B, a crew member served as navigator and gun loader for the pilot-operated nose guns. In an A-26C, that crew member served as navigator and bombardier and relocated to the nose section for the bombing phase of an operation. A few A-26Cs were fitted with dual flight controls, some parts of which could be disabled in flight for access to the nose section. Access for the bombardier was through the lower section of the right instrument panel. In most missions, a third crew member in the rear gunner's compartment operated the remote-controlled gun turrets, with access to and from the cockpit via the bomb bay, only if that was empty. The gunner operated the gun turrets via a novel and complex periscope sight, a vertical column running through the center of the rear compartment, with traversing and elevating or depressing periscope above the gunner seat. The gunner sat on a seat looking into the periscope sight mounted on the column, controlling the guns with a pair of handles on the sides of the column. In later versions of the A-26, the bottom turret was removed and replaced with an additional fuel tank. The Douglas Company delivered production model A-26B aircraft to the United States Army Air Forces on September 10, 1943. The new bomber first saw action with the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific Theater on June 23, 1944, on missions over Japanese-held islands around Indonesia. Pilots in the 3rd Bomb Group's 13th Squadron, receiving the first 4 A-26s for evaluation, discovered the downward view from the cockpit was blocked by the engines, significantly hindering its intended role as a ground attack aircraft. The flat-topped canopy was changed in late 1944 after about 820 production aircraft to a clamshell style with greatly improved visibility. Until changes could be made, the 3rd Bomb Group requested additional Douglas A-20 Havocs, although both types were used in composite flights. Douglas needed better results from the Invaders' second combat test. A-26s arrived in Europe in late September of 1944 for assignment to the 9th Air Force. The initial deployment involved 18 aircraft and crews assigned to the 553rd Squadron of the 386 Bomb Group. This unit flew their first mission on September 6, 1944. No aircraft were lost on the 8 test missions, and the 9th Air Force announced that they were satisfied, eventually replacing their A-20s and B-26s with the A-26 Invader. The first group to convert to the A-26B was the 416th Bombardment Group, who entered combat on November 17, 1944, and the 409th Bombardment Group, whose A-26s became operational in late November. Due to a shortage of the A-26C variants, the groups flew a combined A-20, A-26 unit until delivery of the glass-nose version caught up. Beside bombing and strafing, tactical reconnaissance and night interdiction missions were also successful. In contrast to the Pacific-based units, the A-26 was well received by pilots and crews alike. In Italy, the 12th Air Force's 47th Bomb Group also received the A-26 starting in January of 1945. They were used against German transport links and for direct support and interdiction against tanks and troop concentrations in the Po Valley in the final campaigns in Italy. In 1945, the U.S. Navy acquired one U.S. Army Air Force A-26B and one A-26C for testing. In the immediate post-war years, the Navy acquired 150 surplus A-26s for use by land-based utility squadrons. These aircraft, designated the JD-1, were operated well into the 1960s by 7 U.S. Navy utility squadrons as target tugs, drone directors, and general utility aircraft. In 1962, the surviving JD-1s were redesignated UB-26J in accordance with the new Tri-Service designation system. The JD-1D drone directors became DB-26Js. In June of 1948, the attack category for aircraft mission designation was officially abandoned by the U.S. Air Force, and the Douglas Invader took on the B-26 designation. The redesignation of the type from A-26 to B-26 led to confusion with the Martin B-26 Marauder, which first flew in November of 1940, some 20 months before the Douglas design's maiden flight. With the establishment of the United States Air Force as an independent service in 1947, the Strategic Air Command operated the redesignated B-26 as an RB-26 reconnaissance aircraft in service from 1949 to 1950. U.S. Air Forces in Europe continued operating the B-26 until 1957. Tactical Air Command operated the aircraft as both a B-26 and later designated back to A-26. The final variant was designated B-26K until 1966, when it again became the A-26A. In 1950, with the onset of the Korean War, the Invader was one of the first aircraft to be brought to bear on the enemy. B-26 Invaders of the 3rd Bombardment Group, operating from bases in southern Japan, were among the first U.S. Air Force aircraft engaged in the Korean War. The group and its subordinate squadrons, the 8th, 13th, and 90th, carried out missions over South Korea on June 27 and 28, 1950. On June 29, 1950, the group carried out its first mission over North Korea, bombing an airfield near Pyongyang. On August 10, 1950, the Air Force Reserve's 452nd Bombardment Group was activated for Korean service with its assigned bomb squadrons, the 728th, 729th, 730th, and 731st. It flew its first missions in November of 1950 from airfields in Japan, providing daylight support. On May 17, 1951, both groups moved to Pusan Air Base in Korea, continuing their daylight and adding night intruder missions. In June of 1951, the 3rd and the 452nd joined to form the 3rd Bomb Wing at Kunsan Air Base. At this point, they flew night missions only, dividing the target areas, with the 452nd taking the eastern half and the 3rd the western. In the fall of 1946, the U.S. Navy modified a JD-1 to perform ejection seat testing. Lieutenant Junior Grade A.J. Furtick made the first Navy live ejection in flight from a J-81 Invader on November 1, 1946, near Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey. The Army Air Force was the first American service to test an ejection seat. On August 17, 1946, First Sergeant Lawrence Lampert ejected from a modified P-61 Black Widow night fighter. The first ejection seats were powered by a 37mm blank cartridge, fired in a 38-inch gun barrel attached to the seat. Automatic timers fired smaller charges 3 seconds later to release the test subject from the seat and to open the parachute 3 seconds after that. In addition to the standard attack versions of the B-26 for night interdiction missions, modified WB-26s and RB-26s of the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Wing flew critical weather observations and reconnaissance missions. Invaders carried out the last Air Force bombing missions of the war, 24 minutes before the Armistice Agreement was signed on June 27, 1953. In 1954, the Invader was phased out of the active Air Force inventory, but it would return soon after. In early 1961, about 20 B-26Bs, most converted from B-26C configuration, were sanitized at Duke Field, Florida. They had defensive armament removed and were fitted with the 8-gun nose, underwing drop tanks, and rocket racks. They were flown to a CIA-run base in Guatemala, where training was underway for Cuban exile air crews by personnel from the Alabama Air National Guard. After training, the aircraft and crews were moved to Nicaragua. On April 15, 1961, crewed by Cuban exiles, 8 B-26s of the Cuban People's Liberation Army Air Force attacked 3 Cuban airfields to destroy combat aircraft on the ground. On April 17, 1961, Liberation B-26s supported the seaborne Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Starting in late 1961, small numbers of invaders began arriving in Vietnam, eventually reaching 12 aircraft. The official mission was training Vietnamese pilots, but in actuality some combat missions were flown. In 1963, the U.S. Air Force decided to use the B-26 as a counterinsurgency aircraft, as there were still many in storage. On February 11, 1964, 2 pilots from the 1st Air Commando Wing, stationed at Florida's Hurlburt Field, died in a crash of a B-26 on Range 52 at Elgin Air Force Base, after it lost a wing during a pullout from a demonstration strafing pass. The aircraft was participating in a demonstration of the Special Air Warfare Center counterinsurgency capabilities. B-26 aircraft used by Air Force commandos in Vietnam were grounded on April 8, 1964, following an investigation into the incident. In response to this, the Onmark Engineering Company of Van Nuys, California, was selected by the Air Force to extensively upgrade the Invader for its new counterinsurgency role. Onmark had an exclusive license from Douglas Aircraft Company for manufacture and sale of parts for the upgraded Invaders. The Onmark Executive, the Onmark Marketeer, and the pressurized Onmark Marksman were products of this effort. The first flight of the upgraded B-26 was on May 30, 1964, at the Van Nuys Airport. Onmark converted 40 Invaders to the new counter-invader standard, with upgraded engines, propellers, and brakes, remanufactured wings, and wingtip fuel tanks for use by the 609th Special Operations Squadron. In April 1965, the last Invader, now designated B-26K, was delivered. CIA contracted pilots, some employed during the Bay of Pigs invasion, flew B-26Ks for ground attack against Simbo rebels in the Congo crisis in 1964. Newly remanufactured B-26K counter-invaders were delivered to the Congo via Herbert Field in 1964. In May of 1966, the B-26K was deployed to Thailand to help disrupt supplies moving along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was again redesignated the A-26A for political reasons, as Thailand did not allow U.S. bombers in country at the time. In April of 1967, 2 unmarked marksmen were transferred from Intermountain Aviation, an air service related to the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, to Air America, another air service connected to the agency. The official role of these aircrafts was aerial resupply and low-level penetration. Both aircraft had been highly modified with a variety of navigation and other electronic equipment for this role. Between June and October of 1967, the first aircraft conducted low-level nighttime supply drops to CIA-related forces in Laos during the so-called Secret War. The program was discontinued because the aircraft was too fast for accurate drops, even with the special onboard equipment, and looked too much like the type of strike aircraft known to operate in the theater. A-26A counter-invaders remained in Southwest Asia until 1969. This final version continued in service through the 1960s with active-duty Special Operations Tactical Air Command units, and through 1972 with Tactical Air Command Special Operation units of the Air National Guard. The last Invader in active service, a VB-26B, with service serial number 44-34610, was assigned to the Air National Guard. That aircraft was retired from military service in October of 1972 by the Air Force and National Guard Bureau. In May of 2017, it was transferred to the Museum of Aviation for display. The airframe that is on display at the MAPS Air Museum is a Douglas A-26 Invader with serial number 43-22602. In developing the histories of the aircraft located at the MAPS Air Museum, all available resources are researched and compiled. While most of the source materials are in agreement, some of the information obtained from various sources is inconsistent with the majority of the other data. If this is the case, the information that is presented represents the facts as presented by official sources whenever possible. The A-26 Invader, on display at the MAPS Air Museum, was manufactured at the Douglas Aircraft Plant in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as an A-26C-25-DT with manufacturer number 18756. It was the 251st A-26 produced. It was delivered to the United States Army Air Force on February 23, 1944, with serial number 43-22602. Initially assigned to Hunter Army Airfield, Georgia, 43-22602 departed the United States for assignment with the 416th Bombardment Group of the 9th Army Air Force, located at Weatherfield Royal Air Force Station, England. On September 23rd, the unit was relocated to the Melun-Villaroche Aerodrome in France. On February 13, 1945, the 416th again moved, this time to the Léon-Athis Aerodrome, and finally to the Camille and Vixen Aerodrome on May 25, 1945. 43-22602 returned to the United States at the conclusion of the war in Europe in August of 1945. It was assigned to the 487th Army Air Force Base Unit, Air Transport Command, Hunter Army Airfield, Georgia. In January of 1946, the A-26C was transferred to the 4255th Army Air Force Base Unit of Air Materiel Command, Grenada Army Airfield, Mississippi. In April of 1946, the aircraft was assigned to the 4160th Army Air Force Base Unit, Air Materiel Command, located at Hobbs Air Force Base, New Mexico. In June of 1947, 43-22602 was assigned to Warner Robins Air Materiel Center at Robins Air Force Base, Georgia. March of 1948 saw the aircraft reassigned to the 47th Maintenance and Supply Group of Tactical Air Command at Biggs Air Force Base, Texas. It was at this location that the aircraft was redesignated as a B-26C. A year later, in March of 1949, the B-26 was relocated to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana and assigned to the 47th Air Base Group of the Tactical Air Command. In August of 1949, the aircraft was once again moved, this time to the Ogden Air Materiel Area at Hill Air Force Base, Utah. 43-22602 was reassigned to the 3800th Air University Wing of the Air Force Air University Command, located at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, in June of 1950. With the onset of the Korean War and increased use of B-26s in that conflict, the aircraft was positioned for training and deployment. In September of 1950, 43-22602 was assigned to the 452nd Bombardment Wing of Continental Air Command, located at George Air Force Base, California. In October, the aircraft was reassigned to the 2347th Air Force Reserve Training Center of the Air Force Reserves, stationed at Long Beach Air Force Base in California. In March of 1951, the B-26 was moved to the Sacramento Air Materiel Area at McClellan Air Force Base in California. 43-22602 was deployed in May of 1953 to support the conflict in Korea. It was initially assigned to the 3rd Bombardment Wing, Far Eastern Air Forces, stationed at Iwakuni Air Base, Japan. In June of 1953, a month before the armistice was signed, the B-26 was moved to Korea with the 3rd Bombardment Wing, stationed at Kunsan Air Base. When the unit moved to Miho Air Base in Japan in July of 1953, 43-22602 went with it. In October of 1954, the 3rd Bombardment Wing was relocated to Johnson Air Base in Japan. Returning to the United States in August of 1956, the aircraft was once again assigned to the Sacramento Air Materiel Area at McClellan Air Force Base, California. Its last active duty assignment was with the 2469th Air Reserve Flying Center at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois, beginning in September of 1956. In June of 1957, 43-22602 was placed in storage at the Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Center, or AMARC, at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Arizona, and in November of that year dropped from the Air Force inventory as surplus. AMARC records indicate that the airframe was reclaimed on November 18, 1957 by the OnMark Engineering Company located at Van Nuys Airport in California. It was at this point converted to an OnMark marketeer. It is at this point in the history of this A-26C that the data becomes very vague. Most records show that in January of 1964, the aircraft was purchased by a corporation called Taewin Investment Company, headquartered in Lakewood, Colorado. In March of 1966, the aircraft was again sold, this time to a company called Kimberly Leasing Corporation, a bank holding company located in St. Paul, Minnesota. There is no open source information available on Taewin Investment Company. The business profile for Kimberly Leasing, now in Rush City, Minnesota, has never been claimed, and no open source information linking the company to any aircraft has been found. In June of 1970, 43-22602 was purchased by a private owner located in New London, New Hampshire. In May of 1972, the aircraft was once again sold, this time to an individual living in Simsbury, Connecticut, who placed the airframe in open storage in Springfield, Vermont. In January of 1974, the A-26C was acquired by the Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation of Chino, California. The aircraft was to be delivered to the Mark Wings and Wheels Museum in Orlando, Florida in June of 1975. Photos from this ownership do not show any signs of the on-mark conversion. The airframe was damaged on transit to Orlando when the undercarriage collapsed on landing. FAA records show that the aircraft was registered on October 24, 1975 with FAA registration number N9990 Zulu. The A-26C was on display until December 6, 1981, when the museum closed. In August of 1984, 43-22602 was placed on display with the 94th Aero Squadron Restaurant in West Palm Beach, Florida. When the West Palm Beach Airport expanded in 1995, the restaurant closed. Prior to closing, the aircraft on display were redistributed by Mark to other museums. In January of 2000, the A-26C was disassembled at the West Palm Beach location. The components were loaded aboard flatbed trucks and moved for display to the Historical Aircraft Squadron at Fairfield County Airport in Lancaster, Ohio. The aircraft remained in outside storage. In January of 2012, the Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation again selected maps for assignment of 2 airframes for restoration and display. On January 27, 2012, sections of a BT-13A Vultee Valiant with serial number 41-21271 were delivered to MAPS. On that same date, recovery of the A-26C began in Lancaster. The restoration project started soon after arrival in February of 2012. The restoration process started with determining the general condition of the aircraft after years of outside storage. Then a listing of airframe damage that would need to be repaired was followed by an inventory of the components and assemblies that were missing and would need to be found or built. As the restoration progressed, each of the major components was reconstructed. During restoration of the wing sections, it was noted that the data plates for each wing indicated that Beechcraft Corporation had constructed the wings for 43-22602. Research in this area found that in 1943, the rising demands on Douglas Aircraft Company caused them to look to the Beech team to produce more than 1,600 complete sets of wings for the A-26 Invader attack bomber. On November 16, 2018, the restored major components were moved from the restoration building to the hangar area. On November 20th, the wings were reattached to the forward fuselage and the landing gear installed. 3 days later, the 2 engines were attached to the wings, and on the 29th, their propellers were installed. On December 4th, 2018, the tail was attached. Final detailing was completed in January and February of 2019. The restored A-26C was dedicated on August 8th, 2019. In September, mock-ups of 250-pound bombs were added to the A-26 bomb bay, completing the restoration. The aircraft on display at MAPS is a Douglas A-26C Invader with serial number 43-22602. A-26C, serial number 43-22602, is on loan from the Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation of Chino, California.